Ladies and gentlemen, today I want to speak to you about something profound, something life-changing. There are moments in life when you feel different, when you sense a calling beyond the ordinary, when you realize that you are set apart. And I want to tell you today that if you have felt that stirring in your heart, it is no accident. It is the hand of God upon your life. From the beginning of time, God has placed His mark on those He has chosen, not according to the standards of this world, not by wealth, power, or prestige, but by the purposes of His kingdom. And when God marks you, the world may not understand it, but heaven knows your name. You may have noticed that you don't quite fit in. You walk into rooms, but something inside you tells you that you are different. It's not because you are better than anyone else, but because God has set you apart for something greater. You feel a pull toward holiness, a desire to live righteously, a hunger for something beyond what this world can offer. That is the evidence of His mark upon you. When God calls you, there will be battles. The enemy does not waste his time on those who do not pose a threat. The moment you surrender to God's will, you become a target. Struggles intensify, temptations arise, and trials seem to come out of nowhere. But I want to remind you, God never anoints someone He does not equip. He never calls without a purpose, and He never leaves those He has chosen to walk alone. Perhaps you have experienced seasons of isolation. You've wondered why certain people walked away, why doors closed, why opportunities seemed to vanish. Could it be that God was protecting you? Could it be that He was preparing you for something you could not yet see? Sometimes, before God brings you into your destiny, He separates you so that you can hear His voice more clearly. And when God's mark is upon you, there will be a divine restlessness within you. The comforts of this world will never satisfy you. Others may be content with temporary pleasures, but something inside of you longs for more. It is because you were not meant to settle. You were meant to soar. There will be moments of testing, but there will also be moments of divine favor. When the hand of God is upon you, He will open doors that no man can shut. He will take you places you never imagined, and He will use you in ways you never thought possible. But the greatest sign of His mark upon your life is not in what He gives you, it is in how He changes you. So I ask you today, do you feel the call? Do you sense that stirring in your soul? If you do, do not run from it. Surrender to it. Walk in obedience. Trust His process. And know that when God marks you, He will sustain you. The journey may not always be easy, but His presence will always be with you. Let us bow our heads and thank Him for His calling, His protection, and His purpose in our lives. Amen. When God marks a person, there is something undeniably different about them. It is not always something they can explain, nor is it something the world immediately recognizes. But deep within their spirit, they know they do not fit in with the patterns of this world. They walk into rooms and feel a distinction, a separation, not out of pride or superiority, but because their spirit is drawn to something higher. They see life through a different lens, and their heart longs for something beyond what the world can offer. This is not a coincidence, nor is it something that can be ignored. When God sets someone apart, it is because He has a divine purpose for their life. From the very beginning, God has chosen individuals and placed His mark upon them. Throughout the Bible, we see examples of men and women who were called out, set apart, and positioned for something greater. Moses was raised in Pharaoh's house, yet he never truly belonged there. Joseph had dreams that set him apart from his brothers, and because of that, he was rejected, betrayed, and sold into slavery. David was just a shepherd boy, forgotten by his own family. Yet God had chosen him to be king. These individuals did not seek to be different, but God's calling on their lives made them stand out. When a person is marked by God, they will often experience rejection. Not everyone will understand them, and they may struggle to find their place among those around them. Friends may distance themselves. Relationships may change, and doors may close unexpectedly. This can be painful, but it is not a punishment. It is preparation. God is removing distractions, refining their character, and positioning them for the destiny He has prepared. Sometimes He allows separation because He wants them to depend on Him more than they depend on people. The discomfort of being set apart is a sign that God is leading them into something greater. Being marked by God also comes with a deep inner conviction. There are things others can do without a second thought. But the one whom God has set apart cannot engage in those things without feeling the weight of conviction. The Holy Spirit within them nudges them, warning them when they are about to step outside of God's will. This conviction is not a burden, it is a blessing. It is evidence of God's presence and His hand upon their life. It means He loves them too much to let them settle for less than what He has planned. There is also a hunger for righteousness that comes with being set apart. The things of this world no longer satisfy. Others may chase after temporary pleasures, but the one who is marked by God longs for something deeper. They crave His presence, His word, and His guidance. They may find themselves uninterested in conversations and activities that once entertained them. This is because God is shifting their focus, aligning their heart with His, and drawing them closer to Him. But with this calling comes responsibility. Being marked by God is not just about personal blessing. It is about being a vessel for His kingdom. It is about surrendering personal desires and stepping into the purpose He has ordained. It requires obedience, faith, and trust, even when the path is unclear. It is not always easy, but it is always worth it. Those whom God sets apart must be willing to walk in faith, knowing that He is leading them every step of the way. The world may not recognize it, and people may not understand it, but when God marks a person, His hand is upon them. He orders their steps, aligns their path, and guides them toward His perfect plan. They may feel different, they may experience trials, but they are never alone. God has called them, chosen them, and set them apart for something far greater than they could ever imagine. When God marks a person, they become a target for spiritual warfare. The enemy does not waste time on those who are not a threat to His kingdom. The moment someone surrenders to God's will and begins to walk in their calling, the attacks intensify. It may start subtly. Doubt creeping into the mind, distractions pulling them away from their purpose, or discouragement settling in when things do not go as expected. But as they continue to pursue God, the battles become more evident. The enemy will use every tactic to try to derail, discourage, and destroy what God is doing in their life. One of the first signs of spiritual warfare is an increase in opposition. What once seemed easy now feels like a struggle. Relationships that were once peaceful become tense. Doors that were supposed to open remain shut. Frustration builds as obstacles appear in places where there were none before. This opposition is not always natural, it is often spiritual. The enemy knows that if a person walks fully in their purpose, they will bring glory to God and impact others for the kingdom. So he does everything he can to stop it. Temptation is another common attack. When Jesus was baptized and declared the Son of God, the very next moment was spent in the wilderness being tempted by Satan. The enemy does not tempt people with things they do not desire. He uses what is most appealing to try to pull them away from God's plan. A person marked by God may find themselves tempted in areas they thought they had overcome. Old habits try to resurface. The flesh begins to crave what the Spirit knows is harmful. This is a tactic of the enemy to weaken resolve and plant seeds of guilt and shame. But temptation itself is not sin. Giving in is. The key is to recognize the enemy's strategy and rely on God's strength to overcome. There is also an emotional and mental battle that takes place. Thoughts of inadequacy, fear, and unworthiness begin to flood the mind. Am I really called by God? What if I fail? What if I'm not good enough? These thoughts are not from God, they are from the enemy, who wants to sow doubt and keep God's chosen ones paralyzed by fear. The mind is one of the biggest battlefields, and the enemy knows that if he can control thoughts, he can control action. But God has not given his people a spirit of fear, He has given them power, love, and a sound mind. Isolation is another tactic the enemy uses. When a person is under spiritual attack, they may feel alone, as if no one understands what they are going through. Friends may distance themselves, and support may seem to disappear. The enemy wants them to believe that they have to fight their battles alone, but God never leaves his people. Even when it feels like no one else is there, he is always present. Sometimes he allows seasons of isolation so that he can speak more clearly, removing distractions and drawing his chosen ones closer to him. Physical exhaustion and fatigue can also be a sign of intensified spiritual warfare. The weight of battles in the spiritual realm can manifest in the natural, making even simple tasks feel overwhelming. Sleep is disrupted, energy is drained, and a sense of heaviness lingers. This is why it is crucial to stay spiritually nourished through prayer, worship, and the Word of God. The enemy wants to wear God's people out so they will give up. But those who wait upon the Lord will renew their strength. Despite all these attacks, there is one truth that cannot be ignored. God is greater than the enemy. No battle is fought alone, and no attack is stronger than God's power. The enemy may try to discourage, tempt, isolate, and exhaust, but he cannot stop what God has ordained. Every spiritual battle is an indication that something great is on the horizon. The opposition is proof of the calling. Those who endure will see God's hand move in ways they never imagined. The battle may intensify, but victory is already secured through Jesus Christ. There comes a time in the life of every person marked by God when they experience a season of isolation. It is a period when they feel distant from the world around them, where relationships shift and familiar comforts are no longer within reach. It is not always understood in the moment, but this season is not a punishment, it is preparation. God separates before he elevates. He removes distractions so that his voice becomes the loudest one in their lives. When God prepares someone for a greater purpose, he often leads them into a place of solitude. Moses spent years in the wilderness before stepping into his calling as the deliverer of Israel. Joseph was thrown into a pit and later imprisoned before he was promoted to the palace. David, anointed as king at a young age, spent years hiding in caves before he ever sat on the throne. Even Jesus spent 40 days in the wilderness before beginning his public ministry. These seasons of isolation are not signs of abandonment. They are moments of refinement where God shapes character, builds endurance, and deepens faith. During these times, it may seem as though the people who were once close have suddenly pulled away. Friendships may change, connections that once felt strong may weaken, and a person may wonder why they feel so alone. It is natural to question what is happening, to ask God why certain relationships have ended or why doors that seem so promising have closed. But what may feel like rejection is often God's redirection. It is hard for God's predirection. So is it so comforting when our God rises up in prayer and says, he removes people who cannot go where he is taking his chosen ones. Not everyone is meant to walk into the next season, and God, in his wisdom, allows separation to make room for something greater. There is a deep internal work that happens in isolation. When there are no distractions, no voices pulling in different directions, a person is left with only God. It is in these moments that faith is tested and strengthened. The prayers become more personal, the dependency on God becomes more real, and a deeper understanding of his presence develops. What once seemed impossible suddenly becomes a lesson in trust. In the silence, God speaks. In the solitude, he refines. This process can be uncomfortable. It is in isolation that insecurities rise to the surface, fears become exposed, and weaknesses are revealed. But this is exactly what God intends. He allows these moments not to harm, but to heal, not to break, but to build. The person who enters the season of isolation is not the same person who comes out of it. The struggles faced in private produce the strength needed for what lies ahead. Isolation also brings a shift in priorities. When distractions are removed, desires change. The things that once seemed important lose their grip, and a hunger for God increases. This is where true transformation happens. The plans that were once built on personal ambition are surrendered in exchange for God's purpose. The things that once caused anxiety are placed in God's hands. The isolation reveals what truly matters, stripping away everything that is not necessary for the journey ahead. For those going through this season, it can feel as though nothing is happening. But in reality, everything is happening. Just because the process is unseen does not mean it is insignificant. God is working behind the scenes, preparing the next step, even when it is not yet visible. The waiting is not wasted. The tears are not unnoticed. The prayers are not unheard. God is molding, strengthening, and preparing. When the season of isolation comes to an end, there is always a shift. Doors begin to open, new relationships form, and opportunities arise. But by then, the person who emerges is different. They are stronger, wiser, and more aligned with God's will. They have been tested and refined, and now they are ready to step into what God has prepared for them. The isolation was never about loneliness. It was always about transformation. There is a stirring that happens in the heart of those whom God has marked, a restlessness that cannot be ignored. It is an inner longing, an unsettled feeling that makes it impossible to remain satisfied with the ordinary. No matter how much they try to fit into the routines of life, something inside them is calling them to more. They can sense that they were created for a greater purpose, even if they do not yet fully understand what it is. This restlessness is not a sign of discontentment, but a divine signal that God is preparing them for something beyond what they have known. Many people try to suppress this feeling, convincing themselves that they should be content with where they are. They attempt to fill the void with distractions, busyness, entertainment, relationships, or material success. But none of these things truly satisfy. No matter how much they accomplish, there is still an ache in their soul, a whisper in their spirit telling them that they were made for more. The reason for this is simple. They were not created to live an average life, but to walk in the calling God has placed upon them. When God has marked someone, He does not allow them to settle for less than what He has planned. This divine restlessness often comes before a shift. Before God moves someone into their purpose, He first makes them uncomfortable where they are. What once felt normal begins to feel limiting. Passions that were once fulfilling no longer bring the same joy. Even places and relationships that were once comforting may start to feel out of alignment. This is because God is calling them higher, and what once fit them in one season can no longer contain them in the next. He allows the discomfort not to frustrate them, but to push them toward the place He has prepared for them. Throughout the Bible, there are examples of people who experience this divine restlessness before stepping into their calling. Moses grew up in Pharaoh's palace, but deep inside, he knew he was not meant to stay there. He could not ignore the suffering of his people, and the burden he felt ultimately led him to become their deliverer. Nehemiah lived in comfort as the king's cupbearer, but when he heard about the broken walls of Jerusalem, he could not shake the urgency in his heart to do something about it. David was anointed as king while still a shepherd, and though he continued tending sheep for a time, he must have felt the pull toward the greater purpose ahead of him. In each of these cases, the restlessness was not random. It was God preparing them for the mission He had designed for their lives. Sometimes this restlessness brings frustration, especially when there is no clear direction on what to do next. It can feel like being stuck between two worlds, one foot in the familiar and the other reaching toward the unknown. The temptation in these moments is to force movement, to take matters into one's own hands instead of waiting on God's timing. But when God is leading, He does not just create the desire for something more, He also provides the way to step into it. The waiting period is just as important as the calling itself, because it builds the patience, wisdom, and faith needed to sustain what is coming. This stirring is also an invitation to draw closer to God. When nothing else satisfies, it is a sign that He is calling for deeper intimacy. Instead of running from the restlessness, the best response is to lean into His presence. Prayer, worship, and time in His Word bring clarity. In those quiet moments, He reveals the next steps, even if it is just one at a time. The divine restlessness is not a burden, it is a gift. It is the mark of someone who has been chosen for something significant, someone whom God is preparing for a purpose beyond themselves. When the moment of transition comes, everything will begin to make sense. The restlessness that once felt frustrating will be recognized as preparation. The discomfort will be seen as the catalyst that led to obedience. And as they step into the fullness of God's plan, they will realize that every moment of longing, questioning, and seeking was leading them to exactly where they were meant to be. When God marks a person, the clearest evidence is not found in outward signs of success, prosperity, or recognition, but in the transformation that takes place within them. The true mark of God's hand on someone's life is the change that happens deep in their heart, their character, and their desires. It is not a matter of simply knowing about God, but becoming a reflection of His presence. When God calls someone, He does not leave them as they are. He begins a process of refining, shaping, and renewing them from the inside out. This transformation is not superficial. It is not just about speaking differently, attending church more often, or making slight adjustments to behavior. It is a fundamental shift in identity, purpose, and perspective. The desires of the heart change. The things that once brought satisfaction no longer hold the same appeal. Sin that once seemed small and justifiable now brings deep conviction. There is an increasing hunger for righteousness, a growing passion for God's presence, and a sensitivity to His voice. This change is not forced. It is the natural result of being touched by the Spirit of God. A person who has truly been marked by God cannot continue living as they once did. There is a breaking away from old mindsets, habits, and attachments that no longer align with God's will. It is not that they become perfect, but they become aware. They begin to see the difference between what is temporary and what is eternal. The things of this world lose their grip, and the pursuit of God becomes the greatest priority. What once seemed important, status, approval, material gain, now fades in comparison to the calling to live for something greater. This transformation often comes through a process, and that process is rarely easy. God will use trials, challenges, and moments of brokenness to strip away everything that is not from Him. It is in the fire of testing that impurities are removed. When a person faces hardships, they have a choice: cling to the old ways of thinking, or surrender completely to God's refining work. Those who are truly marked by Him will find that even in the midst of trials, there is an unexplainable peace, a deep assurance that He is working all things for their good. One of the greatest indicators of transformation is love. A person who has been changed by God carries his heart for people. They no longer operate in selfishness or bitterness, but in grace and compassion. They forgive where they once held grudges. They bless those who have wronged them. Their words bring life instead of destruction. This is not a result of human effort, but the evidence of God's Spirit at work within them. Obedience is another key sign of transformation. When God marks a person, they no longer fight against His will. They embrace it. Even when it is uncomfortable, even when it requires sacrifice, they choose to trust Him. They let go of their own plans and submit to His direction. This kind of surrender is not always easy, but it is the sign of a heart that has been truly changed. A transformed person does not just seek God's blessings, they seek His presence. They do not just want His gifts, they want His will. As this transformation continues, the impact spreads beyond just the individual. When God changes a life, that life begins to influence others. The testimony of transformation becomes a light, drawing people closer to God. It is not about perfection, but about progress. It is about a life that day by day reflects more of Christ. Those who once knew the person before will see the difference, not because of words, but because of the undeniable evidence of a heart that has been touched by God. In the end, this is what truly matters. It is not the titles, achievements, or outward signs of success that prove someone is marked by God. It is the undeniable transformation that takes place within. It is the breaking away from the old and stepping into the new. It is the constant refining, the deepening faith, and the growing desire to live fully for Him. This is the true evidence that a person has been set apart, chosen, and forever changed by the hand of God.